It was arrogance that brought us to ruin. It was the Emperor's arrogance to think himself a god. It was the mainlanders' arrogance to think that they could turn their backs on the old gods. It was our arrogance to think that we on the Isles were safe so long as we bowed before the crown. Now, we are all that is left, and if we do not act, the Empress's arrogance will doom us further still. The hordes of chaos march onward, swallowing all in their path. This is our last and only chance. Though we are not friends, we must be allies. None of us can hope to stand against the Imperial legions alone. We are divided in almost every way imaginable, and yet, if we are to live, we must act as though we are united. To discard our past rivalries, to cast off our petty hatreds, to rid ourselves of our arrogance is our only hope of surviving the curse of the last Emperor.
Felicitous greetings, fellow fanatics.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Fanatic, and I hope you enjoyed that intro. This video marks my channel's 2-year anniversary, and to celebrate, I'm doing a review of the largest board game that I've done yet on my channel, Uprising, Curse of the Last Emperor, and its expansions by Nemesis Games. Uprising, Curse of the Last Emperor is a massive 4X game for 2 to 4 players. As no information must be kept hidden from allies, you can also play solo if you're willing to play 2 or more factions. Over the course of the game, you'll need to explore the frozen wastes, fight back armies of monsters and agents of the Empire, found new havens to spread your base of power, learn new feats, and equip yourself with items of power to aid in your quest. But you have to be careful. Every unexplored island may hold both wondrous treasures and terrifying foes. All the while, the Empire's legions will march towards your havens, attempting to snuff out your insurrection before it can threaten them. To make matters worse, hordes of chaotic monsters will march from the frozen wastes that surround you. Although you are not their ultimate goal, they'll destroy as many of your forces as possible as they make their way to assault the capital of the Imperial Remnant. But bear in mind, the Empire and the Chaos are not allies. If their forces should meet, they will battle each other just as readily as they'll fight you. In order to be victorious, players must each individually have more victory points than either the Empire or the Chaos. If any one player lags behind in the end, all of you lose. To set up, you'll first take the 3 game boards and set them next to each other. This can be rearranged as needed, but I'll be using the official suggested setup from the rulebook, which is also what you'll find if you're using the official Tabletop Simulator mod. You'll need to gather components for each player. In the base game, you'll have 4 factions to choose from, the specifics of which I'll get to in a little bit. You'll each take a faction board, its matching havens, which is 5 for most factions, and their army standees, setting them up along it. You'll take 5 of each resource to begin: salt, plunder, and food, along with 8 action point markers. Each faction has 2 heroes, each with their own 10-card deck of feats. You'll flip the double-sided hero card to the appropriate side and take the 2 feat cards from their deck marked Start. Shuffle the remaining 8 cards and take the standee that matches your chosen hero. After that, you'll begin setting up the board according to both the difficulty and number of players. For normal difficulty, you'll remove any and all components that show a red skull on them. These are either more difficult challenges for the players to overcome, or are simply more complex to use. At higher difficulties, you'll mix a number of them in with the regular components before setting up. You'll then set up the map with the capital tile in the center, with islands all around and sea towers on the edge of the map. You'll put your starting tiles on the outskirts as well, also placing your hero and your first haven in that space. You'll place victory point markers for each faction, including the Empire and Chaos, on the 0 spot. Chaos begins with 2 curses on the board and a skeleton just outside of each haven in the frozen wastes. The Empire starts with 4 garrisons, 1 at level 3 in the capital, represented by the 3 tiers of its samurai-style castle, and 3 level 1 garrisons surrounding it to secure its starting power base. You'll shuffle up the quest and item decks and place them in their respective spots on the sideboard. Randomly take 1 event card for each chapter and place it face down on its respective space, and take 4 druids and place them face down in the corners of the map. You'll also need to do the same with the Horde and Legion decks, but not before making sure you have the right number. Each deck should have a number of cards equal to the number of players plus 3 at the start of the game, with the remaining cards being removed without looking at them. You'll choose a player to take the first player marker, and you're ready to begin. Full game of Uprising is played over the course of 4 chapters, although the rules state you can play with 2 or 3 chapters for a shorter and easier game, which might be a good idea if you want to ease yourself into things. Each chapter consists of 7 phases, beginning with the refresh phase. To refresh, you'll flip 1 druid face up with its ability now usable by any player in battle. Each player will flip any face down feats or items they may have, though none should be face down during the first refresh. You'll clear all of your action point markers from your faction board and take them back into your reserve. You'll discard any quests and items that are still out, again, you'll skip this for the first chapter, and deal out 3 new ones face up. And one final step that you'll also skip during the first chapter, the first player marker will be passed to the left. The second phase of each chapter is the events phase. To begin, you'll add 2 threat to any hordes or legions that are currently in play. This won't be a factor in the first chapter since none have come out yet. If a horde or legion is at or near max threat, then any excess will give their respective faction 1 victory point for each overflow threat. After that, flip over the event card for the current chapter. The first chapter tends to give you some sort of boon before throwing you into the thick of things, but later chapters tend to hit you harder and harder. In this case, we've drawn Starving Mobs, which instructs us to place 1 wall and 1 tower on each starting haven. These will aid in their defense if they're ever attacked. More on that in a little bit. After resolving the top half of the card, you'll move on to the bottom. This will tell you to add a number of hordes or legions, with most of the first chapter enemies being hordes, but later chapters will spawn in plenty of Imperial legions as well. In this case, we've drawn the Bloodworm, so we'll place it on any of the spaces labeled as the Howling White, so long as it's not adjacent to a starting haven. Whenever a new horde or legion appears, they have an immediate effect that you must suffer. In this case, the Bloodworm forces us to place a single curse on any hex without an X symbol. We then set its starting threat, generally according to the current event card. Said card tells us that new hordes and legions will start at 4 threat, so we'll place a clip on the 4th level. Threat tells us how strong this horde currently is, effectively showing us how large of an army is following it. It both acts as their health, and the higher their threat, the more powerful their attacks will be. The event card says to place a second horde, so we'll repeat the process to place a horde in the Screaming Sea region. After you finish doing whatever your event card may say to do, you'll place 1 activation token on each horde and legion card, even if something else already gave them 1 or more. You'll place a second token on each of them during the final chapter. The build phase is third up. First, each player draws 2 feats from their deck, keeping 1 and discarding the other. Whenever you discard a feat for any reason, you place it back on the bottom of the deck, rather than forming a separate discard pile. You'll also be able to use your resources to purchase any units and place them on any havens you control. Keep in mind that each hex has a limit of 5 units, but your hero and haven are not units and thus do not count towards that limit. The cost of each unit is listed on your faction board. Keep in mind that anytime you need to spend resources, you can convert 3 of any one resource that you have excess of into 1 of another resource. You also have the option of purchasing walls and towers for your havens. These will give you extra dice in combat if you're defending that space, but you still need soldiers to man them. If a haven has no units when an enemy arrives, they'll be destroyed instantly, regardless of what defenses have been erected. Fourthly is the action phase, where the main meat of the game takes place. Starting with the first player, players now have the opportunity to spend their action points on 7 different actions. You'll notice the actions are divided into 2 columns. The 5 on the right will end your turn so the next player can take theirs, whereas those on the left will only end your turn if it's the final action point that you have. The first and simplest action is Move. This allows you to move your hero into an adjacent hex. The second action is Trade. This gives you 1 salt and allows you to trade items and resources with other heroes in the same hex. There are multiple heroes there, and you don't even have to partake in the trading yourself. You can also take the action just for the extra salt if no one else is in the same space. On to the actions that will end your turn. At the top, we have Command. This costs 1 food each time you use it and allows you to choose 1 hex. You can then move your hero and any units that are adjacent to that space into it. Keep in mind that your hero can pass through mountains and move into unexplored hexes without trouble, but your units will have to find a path around them. Units can come from multiple spaces, but you still must respect the limit of 5 in the target space. Again, heroes are not units and do not count towards this limit. If any of your units move into a space with a horde, legion, garrison, or skeletons, the fight starts immediately. But we'll get to combat in a little bit. Next is the Explore action. If your hero is on a face-down tile that does not have a curse on it, they can flip it face up. You have to be careful though, most hexes will spawn in garrisons or skeletons when flipped over. At higher difficulties, they can even add more hordes or legions into the mix. On the bright side, you'll always get a one-time resource bonus for flipping them, and they often carry other boons as well, but because spawning more enemies in can give you more that you have to deal with, it may be best not to flip it unless you're able to move in an army shortly thereafter. Then we come to the Haven action. If your hero is in a hex that has no enemies and doesn't have a haven or an X on it, then you can spend plunder, 2 for most factions, to construct a haven. Havens are your main source of both victory points and resources at the end of each chapter, and give you another spawn point for your units during the build phase, so you want to construct them as often as is safely possible. Next up is the market action. This allows you to buy one of the 3 items currently available from the market. Each item has its cost and salt listed in the bottom left corner of the card. Many items will also have an attribute requirement shown just above that. Requirements go from 1 to 3 of a single stat, so Call here can use any item that relies on might, as well as items that require 1 leadership. He can't use any items requiring magic or guile right out of the gate, but certain feats can increase your stats. Immediately after you buy or discard an item, you'll draw a new one to replace it. Finally, you have the quest action. When you attempt a quest, you'll roll your hero dice, including those added from any stat bonuses. For Guile, you'll choose either a white or a yellow die. If you have more than 1 level in Guile, then you can mix and match them as you see fit. Each quest also grants 1 bonus die if your hero attempts it in a particular type of space. This may be dependent upon terrain, require them to have enemies in their space, or have other requirements. You'll roll your dice and count up each of the skulls, shields, and lightning bolts. You'll then compare this to the requirements on the card. For example, Instruction of the Druids requires us to succeed in at least 2 categories. So with 4 skulls and 2 lightning bolts, we've succeeded at our task. You always gain the Sol effect when you succeed at a quest, and then you gain the bonuses listed for any category that you've succeeded in. In this case, the skulls don't give a bonus, but Yanni will gain 1 victory point for passing with the lightning bolt. Most quests are discarded after they're attempted, but only if the card explicitly states such. So if she had failed this quest, it would remain in play to be attempted again. If a quest is discarded, you do not replace it unless you are specifically told to do so. Before I end my discussion of the actions phase, I would like to briefly mention sea towers. Each game will start with a number of sea towers equal to the number of players. They tend to be guarded by stronger enemies, but the rewards for securing them are great. Firstly, when a hero or units are on a sea tower, they are considered adjacent to every space on the map, effectively allowing them to teleport wherever they may need to go with a move or command action. Secondly, if your hero is on a sea tower when using a market action, items will cost 1 less salt to a minimum of 0. And thirdly, if you manage to build a haven upon a sea tower, it grants you 1 extra VP each chapter. After all players have expended their action points, it then comes to the Nemesis phase. This is when hordes and legions will activate and march upon their foes. Hordes leave curses behind when they activate, while legions will build or fortify garrisons. Hordes never move away from the capital, but will divert from their path to attack havens or units so long as it doesn't move them away from the capital. Meanwhile, when legions are placed, they will be given a haven as a target. They advance toward it in the least number of moves possible, but again, will also target other enemies along the way. Each horde and legion has an initiative number in the top left corner of their card, and you'll activate them from lowest to highest. Each activates a number of times equal to the number of activation tokens upon it, which means some may activate more than once, and others may not activate at all within a chapter. During any phase, if 2 enemy factions occupy the same space, a battle begins immediately. This can include players battling skeletons, horde, garrisons, or legions. Remember that the Empire and Chaos are also enemies, and will fight one another if they meet upon the battlefield. Firstly, you'll check the space for terrain and see if it affects the battle at all. You'll gather the appropriate number of combat dice. For players, they generally get 1 die per unit in battle, matching a color shown on the bottom of the standee. For hordes and legions, you'll look at their current threat level to determine what they'll roll. For skeletons and garrisons, the details are listed on the board itself. Combat begins with an archery phase. Only ranged units are included here, and most of the time their dice are weaker than others. When you roll the dice, each skull is a hit, but each shield negates 1 enemy skull. Lightning bolts activate special abilities. For players, they can use the abilities granted to them by druids, while hordes and legions have unique abilities listed on their cards. Alternatively, lightning bolts can also be used to negate 1 shield each, but deal no damage in and of themselves. Keep in mind that only Chaos units may use abilities in a cursed space. For each hit a player takes, they must remove 1 unit. Any units defeated by the Chaos or Empire go to their respective graveyards. For each hit a Horde or a Legion takes, they lose 1 threat. Garrisons will likewise lose 1 level per hit. If both sides survive the archery phase, then you'll have a clash phase wherein all units will attack at once. Clash phases will repeat until only 1 side remains, or perhaps even both sides are removed simultaneously. Once all legions and hordes have depleted their activation markers, you'll move on to the production phase. At this point, you'll collect resources both from the number of havens you control and from the spaces they're placed on. On your faction board, you'll see how many resources you gain for the havens themselves, and you'll check the board to see what each space produces. Each faction has their own requirements for building units, so try and plan ahead the types of spaces that you'll build havens on in order to better meet your faction's resource requirements. Finally, you have the scoring phase, where each faction will advance their markers along the scoring track. The Empire gains 1 victory point for each space with a garrison. I repeat, this is each space, not each level, so a full level 3 garrison is still only 1 victory point. They also gain 1 VP for each legion they control, and 2 VP for each faction that's in their graveyard. Similarly, the Chaos gains 1 VP for each space with a curse, 1 VP for each horde on the map, and 2 VP for each faction that's in their graveyard. And finally, each player will gain 2 VP for each haven on the board, 1 VP for each special space they have a haven on, typically their starting spot in the sea towers, and also has the option of paying any 5 resources to give 1 VP to any player, including themselves. You'll generally only want to do this during the final chapter. After that, all units in both graveyards are returned to their reserves. After the scoring phase, you'll proceed back to the refresh phase to begin a new chapter. If the game is already in the final chapter, you'll check victory point conditions to see if you won. If each individual player has more VP than either the Nemesis factions, then the players are victorious. But if even one of them lags behind either the Empire or the Chaos, then the players have failed.
And most players do fail their first time around, especially if you jump right into normal difficulty. Still, it never feels unfair. I've played several times using a mixture of 2 and 4 factions, and I feel like I finally have a handle on normal difficulty. I've yet to mix in those advanced components, but I will be doing so the next time I return to the game.
And return to the game I most certainly will. The base game includes 4 factions, each of which plays very differently from one another. Although units are not that different in and of themselves, each faction has the aforementioned feat cards which differentiate them. Within any given hero's feat deck are 10 cards. Every hero in the game has 2 identical stat boost cards, which also give you a one-time boon of resources. Every hero has 6 faction-specific cards which are shared between them and the other hero of the same faction. And finally, each hero also has 2 unique feats which no one else possesses. For the starting feats, you'll always have one of your unique feats and one of your faction feats. The starting faction feat is different for each hero. The 4 factions in the game feel a lot like your typical fantasy races. You have the orc-like crow that enjoy a fierce, aggressive playstyle, while the dwarf-like Dudakar play defensively and have lots of shields. The elf-like Drun are great for first strike ambushes with their numerous archers, and Feanor is a really fun hero to play as with the ability to ignore item requirements. Finally, the Moihar are a society of humans, and Ranja's Wiles card may be my favorite feat card in the entire game. It gives you a free action, and it can be used to construct a haven without paying resources. Yes, please. On to component quality, the game is one of the best that I have ever seen in this regard. Every single piece just shouts high quality. Of course, the first thing you're going to notice are the numerous standees. These are made of sturdy plastic that won't wear down the way cardboard ones will, each formed to the individual piece's art. You may even notice that they did 3 different versions of the curse standees. In the base game alone, you have several dozen of these, many of which are unique with each hero, horde, and legion having one to represent them. You also have minis for the havens and garrisons, with stackable walls and towers that can be placed on your havens, while the garrisons actually build upwards as they increase in power. Meanwhile, cardboard components are made of blackboard rather than the typical grey board. This was the first I have ever heard of such a thing, but you will immediately notice the difference.
It's a lot denser than normal cardboard and far less prone to bending. You could of course still snap it in half if you really wanted to, but it's a lot harder to do it by accident and just feels so much more satisfying.
Cards are nice and thick and have a protective coating on them to prevent scratching. You might have a bit of trouble shuffling them the first few times, but that just means that they'll be sturdier in the long run. Dice are clearly engraved, and you have a number of reference cards to pass out to players, which makes learning a lot easier. The artwork is excellent. You'll find that a few pieces do reuse the same art, but there's dozens if not hundreds of unique images in the game. And finally, we have the inserts. These come standard with every copy of the game. You have smaller trays for each faction and their components. 2 of them to hold resource tokens that you can set at either end of the table to make it easier for players to reach them, and large trays for the rest of the components. They're made of a nice, solid plastic, not the sort that's going to easily break with repeated usage. Keep in mind that I do have a number of expansion components mixed in here. The faction inserts are designed so that the faction boards and the rulebook can lock in above them, making it really easy to get everything back inside the box. I really only have 2 complaints about the inserts. Firstly, the dice just sit atop of one of the trays. This seems to work fine for people like me that set our boxes down horizontally, but may cause some problems for those of you that store them vertically. The other problem is that the faction trays are a little wider on the base than they should be, and they have scratched the inside of the box as a result. These are both minor issues, and this is still a very high quality insert overall, solid A- material.
But we're not through yet. We have some expansions to look at. Firstly, we have the dice pack. Honestly, I feel a little guilty about being sent a review copy of these. I really don't know what to say about them. It's a set of 28 dice identical to those that come with the game already. They're certainly useful for large games like this, so you can have one set of dice on each side of the table, but you know if you want them, you know if you don't, and there's nothing I can really say about them that isn't already obvious.
Next is the Armory of Azul mini expansion. This includes 22 new items to add into your deck, including 5 advanced items. You simply shuffle them in with the items from the game, and they add more variety to what you can buy. I'm certainly not going to go over every single one, but you can see a few of my favorites here. The Scout Network allows units to pass through mountains, the Traders Guild allows you to swap items and resources from across the map, and the Hidden Village allows you to place a haven on it for VP and resources without the threat of it ever being conquered. This is great for helping a player that's behind to catch up. You also have one stat boosting item for each attribute.
However, the big one is undoubtedly the Arch Nemesis expansion, a full-scale addition to the game. It includes 2 new hordes, 2 new legions, and 2 new sea towers, all of them advanced, that you can add into your game for greater challenge.
However, the expansion's biggest change is probably the namesake Arch Nemesis. When playing with these, you'll add an 8th phase to the first 3 chapters, having an Omen phase after the scoring phase. When this happens, the active player will roll their hero dice. If they manage to roll at least 4 skulls, 2 shields, or 2 lightning bolts, they'll draw 2 Omen tokens and choose one. If they fail, then they simply reveal and resolve the top one. There's a mixture of different effects in there, some nastier than others, and 1 or 2 that are even beneficial. After you resolve the effect, you'll place the Omen tile on the chapter 4 spot. You may notice that I don't have an event card there. When the 4th chapter comes, you don't draw one, but rather you check to see which Arch Nemesis has the highest value from the 3 revealed Omen tiles and spawn it immediately. If you're especially unlucky, you may even be facing 2 of them at once. Arch Nemesis act similarly to hordes or legions, but are far more powerful, acting as a super boss of sorts to replace your normal challenge for the final chapter. They take a great deal of effort to bring down, but if you manage, they reward the players with 9 VP, to be divided up however they choose. The other major part of the Arch Nemesis expansion, and my personal favorite, is the addition of 4 new player factions, each of which is a bit more advanced than those in the base game. As before, each of these are completely unique to one another and further add to the game's already impressive variety. Firstly, we have the Renegade Legion who have defected from the Empire. Their havens cost 1 additional plunder to build, but immediately come into play with a wall and tower to defend them. They also have the only unit in the game that can roll 2 dice at once, and their resource gathering works a little differently from other factions. Next, there's the Tuathon, a defensive faction with a heavy focus on melee units. They're also slow to march, requiring 2 food instead of 1 to use the command action. I especially enjoy using Kushi, who specializes in quests. Each quest he completes allows him to later gain 1 extra die in battle, great for taking on tough foes such as the aforementioned Arch Nemesis. Next, we have the Atuma, who are able to swarm enemies. Although they can still only roll 5 dice at a time in combat, they can increase their stacking limit to allow you to have your full army in a single hex, allowing you to take hits with your cheaper units and leave your stronger ones available to keep fighting. On the downside, they may never place walls or towers on their havens. Finally, we come to the Hawk-Chan. Whereas the Atuma are all about swarming the enemy with overwhelming numbers, the Hawk-Chan go to the opposite extreme and use a small number of elite units. As they have no basic units, they instead gain 1 VP whenever they would otherwise gain a basic unit. They're only allowed to build 3 havens, but despite having less to work with, they can still be quite fierce, with exceptionally powerful feasts to work with. Wait a minute, a faction with a small number of elite units, their infantry are called Zealots, and their ranged units are called Stalkers.
Entaro Adun! Entaro Tassadar! Entaro Zeratul!
And on one final note about the expansion, we have the rulebook. Of course, part of it is just explaining the new rules and factions as you would expect, but the majority of it is actually a short story that details the backstory of the game, as well as having a good bit of art to look at as well. All All in all, Uprising: Curse of the Last Emperor is an impressive game, especially for Nemesis Games' first showing. First crosscode, now this. Is every anniversary review that I'm going to do going to be about games that surprise me from newcomer companies? Nevertheless, what we have here is an amazingly detailed 4X game that perfectly captures the spirit of the genre, and in a co-op no less, which is quite the rarity for 4Xs. It's a challenging game that, as aforementioned, you're likely to lose on your first couple tries, but keep at it and you'll be rewarded with some very satisfying victories. I've only played with the Arch Nemesis once thus far, but it provided for a very satisfying final clash as a massive Atuma horde attacked and took down the Empress to claim victory. And now I can't wait to go back and try it on higher difficulties. I do have one major complaint about the game, and that is the player scaling. As aforementioned, I played several times both with 2 and 4 factions, and it definitely felt a lot easier with 4. I've heard a number of counter arguments from other players, but I've run the numbers and the data does seem to support this. My only other complaint is one that's more about personal taste. The theme is definitely darker than I generally like. Nonetheless, there's a lot of fun mechanics here, and the game has an epic feel to it that makes it a joy to play through. Win or lose, every game felt like an epic journey that had me wanting to come back for more. And with each faction playing so differently from one another, it's unlikely that I'm going to grow bored with it anytime soon. In conclusion, I find Uprising: Curse of the Last Emperor to be worthy of an enviable 9.6 out of 10.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the game's official tabletop simulator mod. I mentioned this mod last year when I showcased official TTS mods, and it has definitely made solo play a lot easier, making setup and cleanup an absolute breeze. This mod not only allows you to experience the full game for free, but it also includes all expansion content as well, including the Blessings of the Old Gods mini expansion that I didn't cover in my review. It is guilty of over-scripting things and automating things that really don't need to be, but the scripting definitely helps more than it hurts.
Before I wrap up, I would like to thank Nemesis Games for this review copy once more. I'm always thankful for any review copies that I receive for my channel, but I know that I've not earned this yet. This is still a small channel, and to receive something this big, especially with all the add-ons, is something that I never would have expected at this point. Thank you so much for helping to make my channel's 2nd anniversary something truly special. Uprising is not coming to retail. However, Nemesis Games has made it very clear that they do intend to do a reprint. For the moment, they're focused on making sure that the first wave of distribution goes cleanly and ensuring that anybody who needs replacement pieces can get them first. The dev team is very active both on Board Game Geek and on their Discord channel, where you can find players to join up with on Tabletop Simulator or see previews of the upcoming expansion. If you're interested in joining them or learning more, links are included in the description. But what about you? What do you think of Uprising? What games from newcomer companies have impressed you? If you have any questions, remarks, or opposing points of view, leave them in the comments down below. And please remember to like, share, subscribe, and ring that bell. And if you really enjoy my work, please consider funding my channel on Patreon. Until next time, farewell, fellow fanatics. Thank you again for watching. I have plenty more to share with you if you're interested. You can click up here above my head to subscribe to my channel. You can click over here on my monitor to see the most recent video that I worked on. Or if you prefer, you can click up here to open this mysterious vault and see what video that the YouTube algorithm has picked just for you.